So welcome everybody to the June meeting of the Moore Coast Audubon Society. We usually have a picnic, but since we can't get together in person, we decided to do it again, do a Zoom meeting this time also. So welcome, I'm glad you're all here. A couple of announcements. One has to do with our past Zoom meetings. We now have two, and we'll have Dave Clendenen's program up within a day on a YouTube channel. Moore Coast Audubon now has its own YouTube channel, and you can access that by going to YouTube and searching for Moore Coast Audubon Society, and you'll find everything that we post in that channel. So have fun with that. If you haven't seen the other programs, they are definitely worth it. No field trips coming up that we know of, sad to say. No in-person meetings that we know of coming up, sad to say. But that doesn't mean that we are not still needing support from our membership. We did not send out our appeal this year, figuring that it was a very stressful time for a lot of people, and we did not want to put more stress on you. However, if you are in a situation where you find that you can spare some extra money for the Audubon Society, we always need it. We need it for being able to send out missives. We need it for putting up posters. We need it for paying our preserve manager and everything else that goes along with managing a preserve and being a presence in the community. So if you're able, please go to Moore Coast Audubon Society's webpage and click on the donate button. So with that, I think I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight. It is a great pleasure. I get to introduce Dave Clendenen. Dave has had a very varied, wide experience in wildlife management. He's worked with the Condor Recovery Office for quite a while, for I think it's 15 years. He worked with peregrine falcons. He worked on reintroduction of golden eagles on the Channel Islands. And, or was that taking eagles off, David? I'm not quite sure.
Bald eagles on Catalina Island.
Bald eagles on Catalina Island, I'm sorry. And he then was working for he was the preserve manager for a 90,000 acre preserve called Windwolves, which is owned by the Wildlife Conservancy on the very southern end of the San Joaquin Valley. If you've never been there, take a time once it opens up again and go. It's a pretty remarkable spot.
It is open again.
It will, yes. So he's now at Cal Poly working with the biology department, and we are extremely fortunate to have him as our preserve manager for the Sweet Springs Nature Preserve. So Dave, in your other kinds of things, you have also done monitoring of the wolves, and that's going to be the topic of your talk tonight. So thank you. Welcome, Dave Clendenen.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us virtually. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about one of my favorite animals. I have many favorite animals, but the wolf is certainly right up there. And I think everybody should see the screen now. Judy asked me to speak briefly to how I got into watching wolves. And basically, my wife Cheryl and I took a vacation in 2003. We went through Yellowstone with the vague hope of seeing wolves. And not only did we see wolves, we saw the alpha female of the Druid peak pack come down off of her den, howl, and then the rest of the pack, including the puppies, howled in return. And so we were hooked for life and started going back every year. So since 2003, we've gone back every year, except 2 years for 2 to 3 weeks in the summer to help with wolf reintroduction. So that's how we got into it. And so with that, I'll go ahead and start. So the gray wolf, Canis lupus, is, in my mind, one of the symbols of wilderness. A wolf howl is one of the most sublime experiences I think you can have in nature. And they're also an incredibly polarizing animal. They're probably the most polarizing wildlife species in North America, if not the globe. People love wolves and people hate wolves. And the story sort of starts and centers around Yellowstone National Park. And Yellowstone is, I'm sure many of you have been there. It's one of my favorite places on the planet. And Yellowstone's a very important place. It's the first national park in the world. We have national parks in over 100 countries in the world now, but that idea started with Yellowstone in 1872 when the park was established. And so we've been visiting Yellowstone all those years now, and we work with this man, Rick McIntyre, who is now in the last year retired, but Rick was a longtime wolf biologist from the Wolf Recovery Project for the National Park Service in Yellowstone, and is undoubtedly one of the world's experts on wolves. And he is one of the most supremely dedicated, if not the most dedicated human being I've ever met. One time, Rick had been in the field every single day, 7 days a week for over 15,000 days watching wolves. So he lives and breathes wolves. And he's an incredibly great and effective advocate for wolves. He gives hundreds of talks each year, many of them formal scheduled talks, and others just impromptu beside the road with people that have been watching wolves with him. He especially loves talking with kids. So Rick is an amazing guy, and it's been an absolute pleasure working with him. So Yellowstone is the great American vacation place where there are iconic things like Old Faithful Geyser, the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone and Yellowstone River, and the Absaroka Mountains, especially, are just sublime, beautiful Rocky Mountains, are really characterize a lot of Yellowstone. The Yellowstone River is a feature of the park, and you see it in many parts of the park. And just as sort of a nerdy geographical sidebar, the Yellowstone River starts its journey. So that water there starts its journey in Yellowstone, flows into the Missouri River, into the Mississippi River. So that water that you see in Yellowstone eventually goes into the Gulf of Mexico. In Louisiana, a journey of over 3,500 miles. So just a nerdy factoid there. So we've learned a tremendous amount of information about wolf ecology and behavior since the reintroductions in Yellowstone started. We've learned a lot of new information. We've actually debunked a lot of sort of old conventional wisdom. And a big part of the reason for that being possible is the nature of Yellowstone itself. Lots of the parks, especially the areas where the wolves thrive, are big, wide open areas where the wolves are very visible for long distances. And there are roads and trails which facilitate the observation. And plus, there's just been an intense interest in studying the reintroduction. So we've learned a tremendous amount as a result of the reintroductions in Yellowstone. One of the places that we spent a lot of time watching is the Hayden Valley, just north of Yellowstone Lake. The Yellowstone River flows through the valley. It's an incredible place for wildlife, especially bird life. And there's an area back here called the Point of Trees, which is a spot where a succession of wolf packs have had dens and rendezvous sites. So a lot of wolf captivity can be seen in the Hayden Valley. And we've also spent most of our time watching in Yellowstone in a place called Lamar Valley in the northeast corner of the park. And Lamar is a haven for wildlife. It's been termed the Serengeti of North America. If you go there in the summertime, you'll see anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 bison in Lamar Valley. And Yellowstone is a protected area. No hunting is allowed there. People are not allowed to disturb the wildlife. but a lot of people go there. And so the wildlife is very habituated, very used to human beings and play out their lives with little regard for people. And so you can see everything going on there with the wildlife species. If you're a wildlife lover, it's one of the best places, I think, on the planet. Certainly in the lower 48 states you can go. Amazing place to see things like black bears, American black bears. We see cubs all the time. And grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are also listed as endangered and are another polarizing animal. But as we'll see later in the talk, grizzly bears have actually benefited greatly from the reintroduction of wolves into that ecosystem. It's a great place, Yellowstone is, to see pronghorn. The pronghorn there are animals that partake in one of the longest big mammal migrations in North America. They migrate out of the park down into the Powder River Basin. And a lot of elk, as throughout Rocky Mountains. And elk are very special animals to wolves. Elk and wolves are one of the classic predator-prey relationships that ecologists have studied. So wolves and elk evolved together. They've shaped each other. And the elk is the primary and favored prey of wolves. And wolves are elk's primary predator. So an ancient, very important relationship. Moose is one of the great animals that you can see in the park, probably fewer than a lot of the other ungulates, but they're always a pleasure to see. And bighorn sheep. It's one of the only places I know, especially early in the season, in spring and early summer, where bighorn sheep are still down in the lower elevations before they go up high in the summer. And they're very visible, spectacular animals. And if you ask just right, quite often they will smile from camp. Some of the other wildlife species, animals we call mesopredators and mesocarnivores, sort of the middle-sized river otters. And river otters are as delightful as you might expect. If you go to Trout Lake in the Lamar Valley and spend a day in the summer, you will almost certainly see river otters, and quite often kits. Badgers, I know of no better place to see badgers. This was a den we were able to watch with 3 kits right beside the road in Yellowstone. And this animal, if you're tuned into this animal, either seeing them or hearing their distinctive call, they are ubiquitous throughout Yellowstone. This is the Uinta ground squirrel. And the Uinta ground squirrel is one of the incredibly important animals near the base of the food chain that plays an important role and is one that actually also benefited from reintroduction of wolves. For bird watchers, Yellowstone's a great place. A lot of waterfowl there, like these scops. It's one of the places where you can go and see trumpeter swans, beautiful, graceful animals. Breed on the lakes in Yellowstone. Dusky grouse, you can see them there in the summer, and you hear them in the forest quite often doing their booming displays. And one of the, I think, the holy grails of bird watching, the great gray owl, is seen in a lot of different places in Yellowstone, and we've been privileged to watch 2 nests over the years of great gray owls. So Yellowstone is arguably one of the most intact ecosystems on the planet. And one of the things that the Park Service does, I think, incredibly well in Yellowstone is facilitating Yellowstone's role as a natural laboratory. It's an incredible laboratory for ecological research. And there's all kinds of research going on. You'll see animals like this female elk carrying a radio telemetry collar. Long-term ecological study of coyotes has been going on. So you see coyotes with radio collars, bison. You'll see biologists on the ground with antennas. You'll see airplanes flying overhead. So a tremendous amount of research happens there. And Park Service does a beautiful job of facilitating that. This is an animal that we knew for several years, a very famous grizzly bear. His nickname was Scarface. because of the extensive scars on the face that he had from all the fights. He had almost no ears left from all those fights. He lived to be 23 years old and carried 8 different radiotelemetry collars in his lifetime and taught us a tremendous amount about grizzly bear behavior and ecology in Yellowstone. So as I said, arguably Yellowstone is the most intact ecosystem in the lower 48 states. But for all that incredible diversity and all those animals, one incredibly important animal was missing from that system for over 60 years, the gray wolf. And as it turns out, they have an incredibly strong impact on the health and function of their ecosystem. And we'll learn about that as we go through the talk. And as I said, wolves are incredibly polarizing animals. People love wolves like I do. And we're incredibly fascinated by wolves. Lovers of wolves are fascinating them. And why is that? And I think there are several answers to that question. I think importantly, they're reflective of human traits. They live in cooperative social groups we call packs. They're family oriented, and the packs are a social group led by a dominant male and female, the alpha pair. The alpha pair form a strong bond and they mate for life. So they're a lot like our families. And they're extremely loyal to their social group. Wolves fight and die for each other and their packs and their territories and their families. And we value loyalty in our friends and our family greatly. And one interesting note of that fighting and dying in a protected area like Yellowstone, the biggest cause of mortality of wolves is other wolves in interpack fights for territory. And outside of protected areas in the park, the most common predator, of course, is man. And, of course, wolves are the ancestors of all of our domestic dogs. Many of us are dog lovers, and once you get to know wolves, you will see their behaviors in your dogs. Wolves have personalities, individual personalities, just like our dogs do, just like people do. And all dogs were bred from the original wolves. And it still boggles my mind that Chihuahuas were bred from wolves. I have known some Chihuahuas that thought they were as big as wolves, but it's nevertheless, it boggles my mind. And the domestication of the wolf is really an important event. It's the first animal domesticated by man. When you think of all the animals that are domesticated now, wolves were the first. And that domestication happened somewhere in the range of 11 to 16,000 years ago. And what that tells us is that domestication predates the rise of agriculture, which implies they were domesticated by hunter-gatherer groups, not agriculturalists. So if you think about that, wolves and man had been interacting, competing out in the natural world for thousands of years before we domesticated them. So our relationship with wolves goes back a long, long ways. And of course, now we're tied to them with our dogs. Again, the polarizing force that are wolves, people love them. This is a photograph of a demonstration. These folks were advocating for the continued legal protection of wolves. And they can be incredibly important to people. This is a little guy that we met in Lamar Valley several years back, and his family had traveled all the way across the country so he could see wolves. He was fascinated by wolves. He wanted to see wolves. And so there he is with his Spider-Man jacket and his new wolf hat. And the family did see wolves that day. And that kind of experience has the power to be a life-changing event. And so I think wolves can be an incredibly important force in people's lives. And there are two groups of people in America who really are opposed to having wolves in the environment. And the first group is hunters. Hunters view wolves as competitors for their game, especially elk. So they don't want wolves out there culling their herds. And the other group are livestock folks, ranchers who raise cattle and sheep. And they actually do have a pretty cogent argument because wolves do take a certain amount of livestock. They do it on public and private land. And so there's a conflict there that will not go away. And if you're a rancher, it can be a pretty marginal economic adventure. And at certain times, when the market is right, cattle can be worth several hundred to $1,000 each. So if you're losing a significant number of animals to wolves, it hurts your pocketbook pretty fast. So that's a conflict that we have to live with. It's not going away. And just to give you a feeling of the passion that people feel, this is some of the rhetoric that's been out there. This was posted at a public meeting to discuss whether we should reintroduce wolves. The wolf is the Saddam Hussein of the animal world, and we don't want Saddam in Montana. This was a thing put in a storefront window in Montana. Kill all the bleep bleep wolves and the people who put them there. So pretty passionate argument. And this is a billboard beside the highway advocating for wolves. So we have a very passionate discussion going on about wolves in our society. And this is a billboard that was put up in Washington State, an advertisement by the Washington Residents Against Wolves, LLC. So one of the real problems with passionate discussions in our society anytime is misinformation. And this is a classic example. The animals on the left are certainly appropriate prey for wolves, especially the one on the right, not so much. In the last 60 years, wolves have been implicated in the deaths of 2 people. In both cases, the wolves were habituated and been fed by people, and it wasn't clear if they actually killed the people. More people are killed every year by bison, by elk, by domestic dogs that have been killed in the last 60 years by wolves. And a lot of things don't help. Our classic stories, Little Red Riding Hood, Grandma was eaten by a big bad wolf, and how wolves are sometimes treated in movies and popular culture. These things add to the misconception about wolves. So I want to go back a little bit to the sort of the story of wolves in Yellowstone. As I mentioned, Yellowstone was established in 1872, the first national park in the world. But when that was done, Congress didn't appropriate any funds to manage the park. They just set it aside as a park. The National Park Service that we now know, it didn't even exist until 1916. And so what happened very quickly was commercial meat hunters and poachers were going to Yellowstone, and they were decimating the wildlife population, the game populations. So in the 1890s, the military was sent to Yellowstone to protect the park. So these were the first park rangers in Yellowstone. Obviously a very different time. A lot of these guys fought in the Civil War. Their commander was General Philip Sheridan, who was a sort of a notorious general for the Union Army in the Civil War, and he was actually the first successful advocate for Yellowstone to petition Congress for funds to manage the park. And I said that the Army was sent to Yellowstone to protect the wildlife, but more specifically, they were sent to protect the game. And this is a picture of soldiers posing with taxidermy heads of poached bison. So they were there to protect the game. It was official policy at that time to eradicate predators, and the military went about their business every day, actively trying to eradicate the predators, the wolves, the coyotes, mountain lions, to protect the game. This is an Army station in the early part of the 1900s in Soda Butte Creek, where we watch wolves a lot now. And so they were posing there with the pelt of a wolf that they had killed. Even Teddy Roosevelt, who was arguably one of our greatest conservation presidents, Teddy Roosevelt established the National Wildlife Refuge System. He was responsible for designating many national parks, many national monuments, tremendous conservator of land and parks. Teddy was also a great hunter. He loved to hunt. And he called wolves the beast of waste and desolation. And like everyone in that time, advocated for the eradication of predators. It was just what we thought was right at that time. Through Teddy's life and into the 20th century, he interacted with John Muir famously in Yellowstone, and then corresponding with each other over the coming years. And then Aldo Leopold came on the scene, and Aldo Leopold wrote a famous book called the Sand County Almanac, and in that there's an essay called Thinking Like a Mountain. And in that essay, for the first time, he put into words the importance of predators, and specifically wolves, to the ecosystem. So Aldo Leopold was really responsible for sort of the genesis, the germ of thought and conservation in our country and maybe the world. And so he was the first to really realize the importance of wolves that we now know. So the history of wolves in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Wolves were eradicated by 1926. The Park Service took over management of Yellowstone in 1916, and they actually finished the job of eradicating wolves by 1926. And then in 1973, Congress enacted the Endangered Species Act, which we all know is one of the great landmark conservation laws in our country. And in 1974, the gray wolf was listed and endangered, giving it its first legal protection in the United States. And then in 1975, we began a 20-year process to restore wolves to the lower 48. It took us 20 years of talking, discussing, quite often very acrimoniously, about whether and how to go about reintroducing wolves to the natural world. Finally, on January 12th, 1995, this is the famous picture of wolves first returning to Yellowstone through the famous arch and the north gate of Yellowstone. And basically how it happened was they trapped family groups, packs of wolves in Alberta and Canada, and brought them down. It was important to bring packs down because the social groups would be at peace with each other and knew each other. If you threw wolves from different packs together, they would probably fight, possibly kill each other. And it was a big deal at that time. I remember this when wolves were carried to the release site. The guy on the right, of course, is Bruce Babbitt, the Secretary of Interior at that time. The woman is Molly Beatty, who was the Director of Fish and Wildlife Service. And I worked in the Fish and Wildlife Service when Molly Beatty was the director, and she was much beloved. So it was a big deal, national news story. And the strategy was basically to bring these wolves down in family groups and put them in acclimation pens and feed them there for a few months during the winter with the hope that they would settle down there, come to accept it as their place. And so when they were released, they would stay in the area instead of trying to find their way home. And one day, they just basically removed a panel from the acclimation pen, and the wolves were free to go. And the strategy worked brilliantly. The wolves stayed in there, kept in their social groups. So in the reintroduction in Yellowstone, a total of 41 wolves were released over a 2-year period. In 95 and 96, or 3 years, 31 wolves are relocated to Yellowstone from Western Canada. And then in 1997, 10 wolves were relocated from northwestern Montana. And these were wolves that were actually naturally immigrating back into the United States from Canada. So a total of 41 wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone in those years. And one of the important reasons why the reintroduction was such an incredible success is that wolves were released into an environment with superabundant food resources. Elk in the Rocky Mountains had not had their primary predator for over 60 years, and they were badly overpopulated. It was well known even in the 1960s in Yellowstone that elk had overpopulated their range and were having negative impacts on the systems there. And so there were tremendous amount of prey animals available for wolves. They went about doing what wolves do. And this sort of illustrates how wolves make their living. They're bringing down an animal that's that much bigger than them with their teeth. And so wolves regularly are badly injured or killed in the act of preying on elk and other large animals. And by the time you're 8 or 9 years old as a wolf in the wild, you're pretty old, you're pretty beat up, and so that's about the lifespan of a wolf in the wild. So to illustrate the success of the reintroduction, after 8 years, the population went from those 41 released to over 300 animals in just 8 years. After 10 years in the Northern Rocky Mountains, this is the population graph. There were over 1,000 animals after 10 years. And the blue part of the graph is that northwestern Montana, those naturally immigrating animals. The pink part is the greater Yellowstone area. And then the yellow is central Idaho. There was a sister reintroduction program to Yellowstone going on at the same time in central Idaho. So after 10 years of reintroductions, there were over 1,000 wolves in the Rocky Mountains. Tremendous success. After another set of years in 2013, so 18 years after the introduction, this was the Northern Rocky Mountain population. And you can see that tremendous rise in the population and then leveling off and diminishing a little bit. And now what we see is wolf populations have apparently reached an equilibrium with their prey populations, and they've been fairly stable. So as I mentioned, we learned a tremendous amount about wolves and their ecology behavior from the Yellowstone releases. We saw the biggest wolf pack ever seen ever in the world. The Druid Peak Pack in the Lamar Valley had 37 individuals. And one of the things that we saw was, as I mentioned, the conventional wisdom that was debunked. It was always believed that only the alpha pair bred in a pack. And with that superabundant food in Yellowstone, we were seeing 2 and 3 females having litters of pups in a pack in a year. Most of those were sired by the alpha male, but multiple females were having puppies, and it's because of that incredibly abundant food supply. And through the years, we've been able to follow family lines, get to know individual wolves. Excuse me. This is Wolf 21M for male, is the alpha male of the Druid Peak Pack. He was an incredibly benevolent alpha male. He fought many fights of challenge for his alpha status. Those fights often lead to the death of one of the animals, usually the challenger. 21 had numerous fights defending his alpha status, never killed any of his antagonists, always made his point, let them go. So that was one of his hallmarks. His alpha female, 42F, was a subordinate female in the pack. Her sister was the alpha who basically ruled the pack, the females in the pack. She was a brutal dictator. She viciously kept the other wolves subordinate in the line, and she actually drove her mother out of the pack. And one night she was attacked and killed. And it's thought that the female wolves of the pack finally got tired of it and ganged up and killed her. And after that, the whole pack, led by 21, went to her den. She'd been forced to den with her pups miles away from the natal den of the pack. They all went and carried her puppies back to the natal den and then were raised as part of the pack. So we've been able to see these incredible stories unfold and these individuals. 06 female was the alpha female of the Lamar Canyon pack, which was the successor to the Druid pack. And she was a force of nature. She was the only female wolves we've ever known that could regularly take down an adult wolf by herself. She was all business. If she was going from point A to point B and there was a bunch of people in between, she might just skirt around the edges. She really didn't care. She was all business. Her alpha male, 755, was an incredibly different animal. He was kind of a big, lazy guy. He didn't care to hunt that much, but he loved taking care of the puppies. And so he sat home and babysat while 06 ran the pack and the hunts. And he was terrified of people. He would go miles around through forests and across ridges to avoid any contact with people. So those individual personalities, just like dogs, just like people, you can see in wolves. So the historic wolf range in North America, you can see the dark area. This is an old figure from a textbook in 1959. Since then, we know that wolves also existed in much of California. And that data comes from evidence from archaeological sites of Native Americans in California. So wolves were integrated into their societies at that time. So from the 1930s to the 80s, this is the only area where wolves remained in the lower 48 states. The population around the Great Lakes, which includes the famous Isle Royale population of wolves that prey on moose up in Lake Superior. And it's a pretty different animal up here. It's a deep forest animal. They prey mostly on moose and deer. And there's no conflicts with grazing animals there. There's no grazing in those forests. And so that population was allowed to persist into the current time. So as of about 2009, this is a little bit of an old graphic. This was the range of wolves in North America, with that Rocky Mountain population expanding out of the releases in Idaho and Yellowstone. And then the Mexican wolf population, a subspecies of the gray wolf, released in Arizona and New Mexico. And now, of course, we have wolves further down into Oregon and in California. So at this point, we have a fairly stable population of about 450 wolves in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which is the actual functional ecosystem that surrounds Yellowstone, not just the arbitrary political boundaries we drew to create the park. One interesting aspect of wolf reintroduction is the economic impacts. And in 2005, there was a study done in Yellowstone, and it was determined that approximately during that year, in 2005, approximately 94,000 visitors from outside the 3 states surrounding the park, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, came to the park specifically to see or hear wolves. So these are people that came specifically to the park to see or hear wolves. They spent an average of $375 a person for a total of $35.5 million in those 3 states. And from 95 to about 2005, it's estimated that the economic benefit of wolf reintroduction to that local community was $58 million. And that number has only astronomically grown since. So if you go to Yellowstone, you will likely end up in a situation like this, a bison jam or a bear jam. I truly believe that bison know exactly what they're doing and enjoy doing this. They'll walk down the middle of the road and stop traffic for miles. And Yellowstone is the only place that I know that it's perfectly acceptable to stop your car in the middle of the road, jump out with your camera, and start taking pictures of wildlife. And if you do go there, you might end up in a group like this. This was in Slough Creek in the northeast corner of the park near Lamar Valley. This is a group of people gathered. The Slough Creek wolf pack had a den that was visible from that area, so people would gather every day to watch that pack. And anytime you may run across a gathering like this beside the road, large groups of people with tens of thousands of dollars worth of cameras and optics, and then you'll see this person on the left here in the yellow vest, the old park ranger. Wolf watchers, visitors, to the park have created a tremendous issue for the Park Service of managing wolf watchers. Unfortunately, a lot of wolf watchers don't have the good sense to stay back far enough, especially photographers. And so they have to manage the visitors to the park to make sure that the wolves are able to go about their business and live their lives without interference from people. And this is a situation where the Lamar Canyon pack had made a kill below their den near the road. And so it was obvious that they would be coming back to that kill. They had puppies in the den. And so they had to put cones to prevent people from parking, and rangers were there in force to keep people back and allow wolves to go about their lives. One of the things that happens quite often is that wolves will kill an elk or another animal either right on the road or very close to the road, which creates a hazard for both people and wildlife. And so what they do, they have this spiffy sled. They load the animal up onto that and hitch up like a dog team. And the woman in the blue jacket there is my wife, Cheryl. We were asked to help relocate this animal. So we put it on the sled, hitched up, and dragged it for about 1/3 of a mile away from the road. And we left it there beside Soda Butte Creek. And then we stood back and watched for 4 days. And during that time, members of 2 different wolf packs visited that carcass: grizzly bears, black bears, coyotes, red foxes, all the avian predators and scavengers, eagles, ravens, magpies, visited that carcass. And after 4 days, we went back, and that's what was left. And so this is an incredible illustration of one of the important aspects of the presence of wolves in their ecosystem is the amount of food that wolf kills provide to other animals in the ecosystem. This was hundreds of pounds of meat provided to all those different species in one occurrence. So ravens are always the first at a wolf kill. They follow wolves around. They hang out with wolves at the den and wherever they're lounging. So ravens have a special relationship with wolves as well. One of the ways in which we've learned a tremendous amount about wolves is through radio telemetry. This is Doug Smith, who is the project leader for the Yellowstone Wolf Project. And once a year in January, they go up in a helicopter and dart wolves from that helicopter, tranquilize them to affix radio telemetry collars. And this is a satellite GPS collar, which sends locations up to the satellite once an hour. So this is a tool that's allowed us to track with incredible detail the movements of individual wolves and their packs. One of the interesting aspects of wolf ecology is dispersal. Each one of these arrows represents a dispersal track of an individual wolf from its home territory. And wolves disperse. About 25 to 30% of the population each year disperses. And they do that when they're just around 3 years of age. And those dispersals happen all year, but they gradually increase in fall and peak in January. And that's because the breeding season for wolves is in February. So if you're a subordinate wolf about 3 years old living in a pack, you have an incredible drive to breed and pass on your genes, but you're unable to do so, so you leave the pack. So you can see these incredible dispersal paths which allow wolves to colonize new territory and also to facilitate gene flow in the population. So in 2011, which is thought to have been the peak of the reintroduced population in the northern Rocky Mountains, each one of those dots represents a wolf pack, a breeding pair. And it's estimated there were 1,774 wolves and 287 packs in 2011, which of course is 16 years following that initial reintroduction. In 2014, each one of these polygons represents a wolf pack in Washington. So they started dispersing into Washington and Oregon in about 2008, 2009. In 2014 in Oregon, each one of those is a polygon of a wolf pack in Oregon. And there were some famous of these dispersal tracks. The lone wolf of Grand Canyon showed up on the Kaibab Plateau in the north rim of the Grand Canyon. It was determined through DNA analysis of his scat that he came from a pack in northern Wyoming. And OR7, OR for Oregon, seventh wolf radio collared in Oregon, was the first wolf in California in 67 years. So as a direct result of those reintroductions in Yellowstone and Idaho, wolves re-entered California. He carried a radio collar, and this is his track, his dispersal track, wandering around, looking for food, looking for other wolves to form a pack with, or a pack he could join. And he spent the first several months of 2012 in California. Each one of those colors represents a month's time of him wandering through California. Right here is Lassen National Park, so up in the northern Sierras, southern Cascades. And eventually, OR7 went back to the Klamath Lake area of Oregon and formed the Rogue Pack. And he is still the alpha male of the Rogue Pack there in the Klamath area in Oregon. Then in 2015, it was announced that the first resident wolf pack in California had been established in Siskiyou County, first known pack since 1924. And since that time, that wolf pack has disappeared. We don't know if they moved or if they were killed, but we now have a second pack and several other individuals wandering around in the Lassen Volcanic Park area. So 2 wolf packs in California so far. In California, the wolves still have legal protection. They're still listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act, and they're listed in the California Endangered Species Act. And of course, the old conflict, the California Cattlemen's Association is lobbying for a regulatory change to allow take of wolves that prey on livestock. So that livestock wolf conflict now exists in California. So I've talked a little bit about the ecological impacts of wolves. Incredibly important animal, a member of that ecosystem that we didn't know back in Teddy Roosevelt's time, but now greatly as a result of the Yellowstone reintroduction, we understand this very well. And wolves are 2 things to ecologists. They're apex predators, which is a predator residing at the top of the food chain on which no other creatures predate. And they play a crucial role in maintaining the health of their ecosystems. And ecologists also know them as a keystone species. And that's a species that has a disproportionately large effect on its environment relative to its abundance, and play a critical role in maintaining the structure of an ecological community. So relatively few animals have an incredible impact on the health and function of their ecosystem. So following the release of wolves in Yellowstone and central Idaho, wolves went out and started making a living as wolves do, and they preyed on especially elk, and they reduced the numbers in that overpopulated elk herd. But they also did something very important. They changed the behavior of elk. We call the ecology of fear. Elk had not had a primary predator in over 60 years, and so they had gotten pretty lazy. They spent most of their time down in riparian areas and wetland areas, sensitive habitats, and they were having tremendous negative impacts on those areas. And because of the ecology of fear, now elk had this incredible predator dogging their tracks. Elk behavior changed. So now instead of seeing elk down in those riparian areas, those wetland areas, you're most likely to see elk up on ridges in grassland and sagebrush country where they can see predators coming. And so that change in behavior and the diminishing numbers of elk had a tremendous impact on the environment in Yellowstone. Before the reintroduction, this was a typical scene, aspen grove here, and there's something very important missing from that aspen grove, and that's young trees. All you see there is old trees, the logs, the carcasses of dead trees, no reintroduction, reproduction, no regeneration of young trees. After 10 or 12 years of wolves being on the landscape, you start seeing these regenerating groves of aspen and cottonwood and willows, all that riparian habitat started to regenerate. And so now this is the typical scene. Instead of all those old aspen, now we have regeneration and stratification of age classes. This is an area we watch wolves. It's the confluence of the Lamar River and Sotobu Valley. Prior to the reintroduction, just a grassland bench there. And now that's returning to this great riparian woodland. So what's happened and what ecologists have documented in Yellowstone is a result of that release of wolves is a trophic cascade. And a trophic cascade is a cascade of events through the food chain brought on by a single event at the top, and that's the reintroduction of wolves. On the left, you see sort of this idealized look at what it was like when wolves were absent. Elk hanging down in those riparian and wetland areas. They denuded the streamside vegetation, the riparian vegetation, excess erosion, runoff, and sedimentation in the water. So dirty water, higher water temperatures, and no wolves. Following the reintroduction, we have this change. Now we have wolves. Elk spend more time in the uplands. Riparian habitat is restored and is regenerating, which brings songbirds back for nesting, and beavers. Beavers were almost absent. So now what we have in this new situation as a result of the trophic cascade is recovering trout populations, the native cutthroat trout, higher water quality. Trout populations are increasing. Songbird nesting in riparian areas is greatly enhanced because the riparian vegetation has returned. Beavers have returned. Beavers are also keystone species. They're ecosystem engineers. They create beaver ponds with their dams, which can be extensive habitats and are incredibly rich biodiversity hotspots. So beavers have returned, which is an incredibly important impact on the environment as well. And we talked about all the food supply that was brought to the other animals, the other carnivores and scavengers in Yellowstone. We now see grizzly bears hibernating later into the winter and then waking up for hibernation earlier in the year because of that extra food supply that's there provided by wolves. All the avian scavengers, ravens, magpies, eagles, those populations have benefited from the extra food supply provided by wolf kills. Coyotes. Coyotes were overpopulated. Wolves are predators and competitors of wolves, and coyote populations were out of balance because of the absence of wolves. And now after the return of wolves, coyote populations are now back to a more sustainable level. And now there's more Uinta ground squirrels. Coyotes have diminished Uinta ground squirrels. So now that there are more Uinta ground squirrel, there's more predator or food available for the meso predators like red foxes, badgers, and eagles. So a few graphs of some of the research following and documenting the trophic cascade. You see the population of wolves, that incredible increase in population following the reintroduction, and now this sort of decline and stabilization in their population. Their primary prey species, elk, diminishing, being controlled, and now leveling off. So wolves and elk have apparently reached an ecological balance. The percent browsing on the stems in the riparian habitat dramatically decreases. Cottonwood regeneration. Cottonwoods were basically not regenerating. All of a sudden they exploded. Beaver populations were barely hanging on. Beaver went crazy. And one of the things that wasn't really expected was that bison populations actually increased following the reintroduction of wolves. And that's probably due to the fact that elk are no longer consuming so much of the vegetation, and so they're more forage available for bison now. So question arises, can human simulate the effect of wolf predation on the ecosystem? Can we as human beings on our own go about management efforts and have the same incredible positive effects on the ecosystem that wolf has? And I think the answer is undeniably a no. In the first place, wildlife management, our biggest tool of wildlife management, game management, has been hunting. And this is the animal that is selected by hunters. And this is the prime animal in its prime, the breeding animal that should be passing on its genes. Those are the animals we select. Wolves have the ability to detect sick, weak, and old animals, and those are the animals that they prey on, so their effect on a population is actually a positive impact on the health of that population. And then the ecology of fear. We'd have to have people running around riparian and wetland areas, shooing elk out of the areas to prevent them from having those impacts on those delicate, sensitive habitats. So we're really incapable of simulating the effects of wolves in the ecosystem that they have. And here's the classic graph shown together, the classic predator-prey relationship of wolves and elk. Wolf populations increasing and now diminishing, and the elk diminishing and then reaching a stable state. And here you see the Yellowstone National Park wolf numbers, this incredible now, nice stable population that we're seeing now. So those of us that know about the Endangered Species Act are aware that one of the things that the Endangered Species Act does is it mandates, it requires the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to prepare what we call a recovery plan. And a recovery plan basically lays out the reasons why that species is now endangered, what caused them to be diminished and endangered. It lays out management actions to attempt a recovery of those animals, and it sets goals for that recovery. And when those goals are reached, then it's time to delist that animal, remove it from the endangered species list. So that's basically what's happened. We've successfully recovered wolves in the Northern Rocky Mountains, and in 2005, wolf management was transferred to some of the states who had management plans. But it took another 6 years of court battles with environmental groups. Listing went back and forth. Then finally in 2011, wolf populations were delisted by an act of Congress by a writer in an unrelated budget bill, which basically tells you that that final delisting was a political act and not a biological decision. So now we have wolves managed by the states in the Rocky Mountains. And in the states, they're not so welcome. The agriculture and hunting interests are very powerful in those states. And so the states manage the populations. You can now buy a tag, a hunting license for a wolf, just like you can an elk for a deer. There now are derbies where you get a prize for the most and the biggest killed. And this is a famous, notorious Facebook post where these guys were advocating the 3 S's, shoot, shovel, and shut up. They're basically advocating that you go out in the world and kill all the wolves you can, get them off the landscape. But these guys are pretty ignorant because they're shooting themselves in the foot, really, because the states are still mandated to maintain minimum populations of wolves, and if those populations dip below those minimum mandated populations, the wolves will be relisted as endangered. And we're not alone in our treatment of wolves. This is in Russia. Wolves are persecuted there. In Sweden, which we think is a much more sort of a progressive society, wolves are persecuted sometimes there. And this is interesting. I love this. You may be cool, but you'll never be Mongolian wolf hunter riding home holding the eagle he used to hunt the pelts he's wearing cool. Most indigenous cultures coexisted with wolves sustainably. Many revered wolves, and there's still a culture in Mongolia that sustainably hunts wolves with eagles, and they're an incredibly important animal. So it's interesting that most indigenous cultures coexisted and respected wolves. So one of the biggest conflicts, as we've mentioned, is agriculture and livestock industry. This is the chart, National Agricultural Statistics Service, on the different causes of mortality in the cattle industry over a year. And if you distill that down, you see that 94.4% of cattle mortality is health problems, weather, poisoning, and theft. Non-wolf predators, which are coyotes, mountain lions, bears, and domestic dogs, account for 5.4% of cattle mortality, and 0.2 are attributed to wolves. If you look at data from the National Agricultural Statistics Service, 2009, they estimated that 12,200 sheep were killed by weather. In that same year, 15,000 were killed by coyotes, 600 sheep by domestic dogs, and 600 were killed by wolves. So undeniably, wolves kill livestock, but in the big picture and statistically, it's a very minimal percentage. Again, that issue of misinformation depends on where you get your data. If you look at the National Agricultural Statistics Service, which takes unverified losses, anybody can call and report livestock losses. According to them, in Idaho, 2,561 cattle were killed by wolves. And according to the Fish and Wildlife Service, that verifies each and every one, they say that 75 cattle were killed by wolves, a difference of a whopping 3,415%. So finding the true information is pretty difficult in these passionate discussions. I'm guessing the truth lies somewhere in the middle and probably on the lower end of the scale. We do have programs now. The Defenders of Wildlife has the Wolf Compensation Fund, where they compensate ranchers with market value for verified losses of livestock to wolves. And these are the numbers in each state that have been given out as of 2009 to ranchers to compensate for loss of wolf predation. And we have some interesting programs where people are trying to find ways to coexist with wolves and not control them lethally. The Range Riders program, they use fladry, these flags around herds to make wolves shy away, and they actually work fairly well. Increased vigilance around the herds. Instead of just taking them to the summer range and leaving them by themselves for the summer, they stay with the animals. Livestock protector dogs that stay with sheep, and then use of radio telemetry to detect when wolves are in the area. So these are people that are trying to find non-lethal ways of cohabitating and coexisting with wolves. We now have the Livestock and Wolves, a guide to non-lethal tools and methods to reduce conflicts, which has grown out of that project. And finally, an important article that came out in the scientific literature in 2014, paper by Wheelgus and Peebles. And they analyzed 25 years of lethal control data. And this is basically when wolves were preying on livestock, wildlife agencies would go out and lethally control wolves that were the offending wolves. So they analyzed 25 years of that control data, and they found that actually killing one wolf increases the odds of depredation 4% for sheep and 5 to 6% for cattle the following year. So removing a single wolf actually increases the rate of predation the following year. And the reason for that is the lethal control of wolves is believed to disrupt the social cohesion of packs. So a lot of alpha pairs are being killed, and the packs are disrupted and broken up. And so you have more breeding pairs and more free animals out there running around, and predation actually increases. And they also determined that basically to diminish the predation rates of wolves on livestock, you have to kill 25% of the wolves in an area. And finally, that rate, 25% of wolves mortality, is unsustainable. So you have to kill a quarter of the wolves in an area to diminish livestock depredation, but wolf populations cannot be sustained on that level of mortality. So that's more or less where we are today. The discussion continues. Wolves are actually doing pretty well in all those states. The populations are doing quite well, and they're still expanding. They're in all the Rocky Mountain states, and now in California. So that's the story so far. So stay tuned. It's an incredible animal, and I encourage you all to go to Yellowstone and try to see it.
So Dave, Tyra, did you pick up any questions?
Yeah, I've got, let's see, from Linda in Sedona. Do the wolves ever try to remove the collars put on them? Does it interfere with their lives?
That is a great question, and there's two answers to that. There's been a lot of study of that, and there's never been a documentation of any serious deleterious effects. An alpha animal has never lost its status following its being radio collared. Wolves still participate in hunts. They still are able to bring down prey. There is no detectable increase in mortality. So they seem to do very well with the collars. There have been certain packs who have learned to chew off the radio collars. And so they're early on, especially, there were 2 packs in Yellowstone that they just could not keep radio collars on because the other members of the pack would chew them off. But the individual wolf itself cannot remove those radio collars.
Okay, and from Corey Black, what state has the best protection services for wolves?
Probably Oregon these days. And Washington's not bad, but Washington has fallen more in line. Probably the worst is Idaho and Wyoming, and then Montana. But Oregon, I think, is the most progressive and best hosts of wolves.
And Rick Daravan asked, is the Trophic Cascade theory fully accepted? I thought there was some controversy about that.
There is some controversy about it. There's been some people in discussions, sometimes scientists, to say that it's awfully hard to say that those trophic cascades were actually a direct result of the reintroduction of wolves. However, the counter argument is that there was nothing else of any magnitude, any change in the ecosystem in that period except the introduction of wolves. So there's really no other logical or significant, meaningful cause of the trophic cascade other than the reintroduction of wolves.
Does anyone have any other questions?
I don't particularly have a question, but I wanted to thank everybody for coming. And thank you, Dave, for a great lecture. I learned a lot on that.
You're very welcome.
So we do not have a program in July or in August. Our next program will be in September, and we're still working on what that will be. You can go to the Mora Coast Audubon Society website and find information about that.